Welcome to Kingdom Uncensored. My name is Nia Nicole, and today's message is aiming straight for your heart. If you feel weary, tired, or frustrated, then this message is for you. If you feel disappointed, discouraged, confused, or sad because it feels like your blessings have been waitlisted or delayed, then this message is for you. If you've patiently waited or haven't seen the promises of God come to pass yet, God is dilating your eyes and shifting your focus on Him. God said that He wants you to go back to the place where He found you. God said He wants you to go back to the place where you first discovered who He is to you, not what He could do for you. God said He wants you to go back to the Garden of Eden where there was God and Adam before Eve. Sometimes we get so caught up in the picture that we forget who crafted the frame. God said to go back to the place where ministry was your motive, not a business incentive. God said to go back to the place where you changed and didn't compromise. God said to go back to the place where you first fell in love with God. Some have fallen out of love with the author of love. Some have exalted the promise more than the promise keeper. Some have prayed to experience the blessing more than the blesser. Some have idolized their prized possession more than they praise the possessor of the prize. God said to go back to the place where humility was your portion. For some, haughtiness is their plate and it has left residues. God said to go back to the place where you addressed sin and you didn't dress up sin. God said to go back to the place where you fell in love with God's heart, not His hand. God said to go back to the place where you don't ever treat the Bible like a checklist and you be flipping pages so much like you got a bent wrist. God said to go back to the place where righteousness, holiness, and purity was your standard. God said to go back to the place where you first got saved and you were born again. Go back to the place where your prayers sounded something like this: Lord, what do you want for me? Not, Lord, what can you do for me? God said to go back to the place where your praise was based on faith and not feelings. God said to go back to the place where spending quality time with God was a blessing, not an inconvenience or a burden. God said to go back to the place where you had elastic faith. Your faith could stretch but never break. God said to go back to the place where His word was a meal and not a vitamin supplement or a condiment. God said to go back to the place where God's provision was His promise, not your preference. God said to go back to the place where God was your reward and He wasn't a rebound. God said to go back to the place where He was the prize and not a safe choice. God said to go back to the place where intentionality and punctuality was a priority. God said to go back to the place where He exchanged your crown of shame for His crown of glory. God said to go back to the place where you valued a relationship with Him and not relations with Him. God said to go back to the place where you worked out your salvation and not work for your salvation. God said to go back to the place where disobedience was no longer an option and obedience became your mandate. God said go back to the place where the road was narrow enough for only you and God to walk and talk together. God said go back to the place where you praised God more than you murmured and complained. God said to go back to the place where He fixed your crown because it was slanted. God said to go back to the place where trusting Him was a priority, not a primary issue. God said to go back to the place where the enemy wanted you to take a plea deal and hell should have been your death sentence, but God gave you life. God said to go back to the place where you were about to check out, but Jesus gave you a free offer with salvation as the promo code. God said to go back to the place where faith wasn't a question, but rather a statement. God said to go back to the place where He found you in your brokenness. You would have never known what it felt like to be healed unless you were broken. God said to go back to the place where you gave God your yes, even when you knew there were things that you prayed for and the answer would be no or not yet. God said to go back to the place where you were a prisoner and God had the keys to unlock your cell. God said to go back to the place where He selected you despite the people who rejected you. God said to go back to the place where He dilated your eyes to focus on Him, not her, not they, and not them. God said to go back to the place where you felt valueless, but God showed you that you were valuable. God said to go back to the place where Jesus was your lifestyle, not a brand. Go back to the place where you were on your knees because only God can bring you to your feet. God said to go back to the place where you sought His face at His throne of grace and turned away from your selfish ways. God said to go back to that place.